Tonight, we are pleased to host former United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, in a discussion about her new book, With All Due Respect, Defending America with Grit and Grace, which offers a firsthand perspective on national and international matters, as well as behind-the-scenes account of her tenure in the Trump administration. Ambassador Haley will be joined tonight by moderator and United States Senator Joni Ernst, who in 2014 was elected as the first woman to serve in federal elected office from the state of Iowa. Please enjoy this evening's discussion, and thank you for being here.
Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to GW University. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We are going to have a wonderful discussion with Ambassador Nikki Haley. Can we say thank you to her one more time, please? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. President LeBlanc, thank you very much. SJ, thank you for being here as well. We are going to have a lovely discussion this evening with Ambassador Haley. And we will start with about 45 minutes of questions. And those are questions that I'll be asking you, Ambassador. And then we'll move on to about 15 minutes of questions from the audience. So with that, Ambassador, would you like to start with some remarks?
Yes, so first of all, it's great to be at GW. I have to tell you, President LeBlanc, thank you for hosting us tonight and allowing us to be here. SJ, you're a rock star. We're excited to watch everything that you do. But I was actually here on campus because our son is looking to come to GW next fall. So we will see if that happens. There is a bit of an application process we have to go through first. But having said that, thank you for having us. But seriously, I know I'm here, but how cool is it to have the first female combat veteran in the Senate here with us, Joni Ernst. You were so nice to do this, and we're just going to have a fun conversation and hang out for a bit. So
that sounds great. And when the folks from the ambassador's office had called, and my staff reached out to me and said, you know, would you like to? And the minute they said Nikki, I was like, yes. I didn't even know what it was, but I was excited to do it. So with that, Ambassador, we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to take us back a little bit in history, because a lot of folks maybe don't know about your background or how you grew up. And so we'll start there, because I think it really sets the stage for the wonderful years yet to come. And you really describe your American story and how you didn't quite fit in as a girl growing up in the South. And what was that experience like for you, growing up as the daughter, we all know, of Indian immigrants, and you were living in rural South Carolina?
So we lived in a small town called Bamberg, South Carolina. We were the only Indian family in that town. We weren't white enough to be white. We weren't black enough to be black. My father wore a turban. He still does to this day. My mother wore a sari. They didn't know who we were, what we were, or why we were there. And I remember being on the playground and coming home after being teased. And my mom would always say, your job is not to show people how you're different. Your job is to show people how you're similar. And it's amazing how that lesson I learned on the playground played out in my life in the corporate world, as a legislator, as governor, as ambassador, because when you're faced with a challenge, if you first talk about what you agree on first, people let their guard down. And then you're more likely to get to a solution by pushing through that challenge. So little did I know that turned out to be a great lesson along the way.
And what a great lesson. And your mother is wise beyond her years. So
Yes, she tells me that every day.
Of course she does. She's a great mom. And okay, so some folks might not realize that before you were Ambassador Nikki Haley and before you were Governor Nikki Haley, you actually served in the legislature. Is that correct?
I did. So what's interesting is my mom started a business from scratch. And a few years into her business, her accountant was going to leave. And she needed to train someone. And finally, a few days before she left, she said, look, I'm getting concerned. We don't have someone to train. I happened to be walking by. And my mom grabbed my arm and said, train her, she can do it. And she said, but she's 13. And she said, train her, she'll do it. So at 13, I was balancing the bank account, writing out the checks, making sure that we were doing bank deposits, the whole bit. It wasn't until I got to college that I realized that wasn't normal. Now I totally realize that was child labor. But through that process, I developed a love of numbers and the fact that numbers tell a story and every problem can be fixed by moving the numbers around. And so ended up graduating with a degree in accounting from Clemson University, go Tigers. And then went on to the corporate world and got tired of working for the guys down the hall, came back home to the family business. And one day I was just sitting there complaining again, and my mom was there, and I was complaining at how hard it was to make $1 and how easy it was for government to take it. And my mom said, quit complaining about it, do something about it. I did not know you weren't supposed to run against a 30-year incumbent in a primary. I truly didn't. Ignorance is bliss sometimes. I wasn't that kid in college that was in politics. I never knew to go for student government. That wasn't me. So once I realized what I got myself into, the only option was to win. So my husband drove, I was in the passenger seat, the kids were in the back seat, and we started knocking on doors. And he was the longest serving legislator at that time in the state of South Carolina. And I would knock on doors and not say anything disparaging about him. I would say, we appreciate what Mr. Kuhn has done all these years, but we think I think that I could do something different. And I always just talked about me. I didn't talk about him. And was fortunate enough to get elected. And then fast forward a little bit, I'm in the legislature a few years, and in South Carolina, whenever they were passing legislation, it was done by a voice vote. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Well, one day there was a piece of legislation that went across the desk that gave legislators pay raises. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, silence. The ayes have it. But to this day, you can't find one legislator that said they voted themselves a pay raise. And I got really upset and went to the Speaker of the House and I said, this is why people don't trust us. And the next day I filed a bill that said, anything important enough to be debated on the floor of the House or the Senate is important enough to have a vote on the record. The Speaker called me in. He said, put the bill away. We don't need to have it. We will decide what the public needs to see and what they don't. I remember going home that night and talking to my husband and saying, if I can't even get legislative votes on the record, what am I doing here? And he said, well, then go fight. And so I went across the state of South Carolina and said, did you know of all the bills passed in the House, only 8% were on the record? Did you know of all the bills passed in the Senate, only 1% was on the record? So if you didn't know how your House member voted 92% of the time, if you didn't know how your senator voted 99% of the time, how did you know who to vote for when you got to the polls? And the people of South Carolina were shocked. To put it all in perspective, my first year in office, I was chairman of the freshman class. My second year, I was majority whip. My third year, I was put on a powerful business committee. My fourth year, I was subcommittee chair of banking. The year I wouldn't put the bill away, they stripped me of everything. I could go to the well, no one would hear a bill. I could try and get support, I couldn't get it. So I ran for governor.
And you won.
And proud to say that one of the first bills we signed into law is now in South Carolina. Any piece of legislation that's debated on the floor of the House or the Senate has to have a vote on the record. And we took it a step further, and they have to show their vote on the record on every section of the budget as well.
Good. No, very inspiring. Very. And yeah, I love it. I love the transparency. So this next question, folks, and this is a hard one, really. And you have had such an inspirational life, Nikki. And I'm going to go back to probably some very hard, dark days that you had as governor of the beautiful state of South Carolina. And many of you will know what I'm referencing, but out of despair can come inspiration and true leadership. And so this next question, Ambassador, you talk about the tragic killing of 9 innocents at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in 2015. During your time as governor, which led to the decision to bring the Confederate flag down from the grounds of the state capitol, can you tell us a little bit about that time and how that incident affected the people and the state of South Carolina? And then as well, if you can, what did you do to bring those citizens together, reunite everyone?
Well, and my heart goes out to the community in California that had the shooting today. I mean, when something like that happens, it's not just the people in the room that are affected, it's the entire community is affected. And on that night, we had 12 people who did what so many people in South Carolina do on every Wednesday night. They went to Bible study. But on this night, someone else showed up. He didn't look like them, he didn't sound like them, and he didn't act like them. They didn't call the cops, they didn't throw him out. Instead, they pulled up a chair and they prayed with him for an hour. And when they bowed their heads in that last prayer, he began to shoot. These were people like Ethel Lance. She had lost her daughter 2 years prior to breast cancer, and she had a broken heart. But she would go around the Mother Emanuel Church, cleaning the church, and she would sing, "One day at a time, sweet Jesus, that's all I ask of you. Give me the strength to do every day what I have to do." Our youngest victim, Tywanza Sanders, just graduated college, was so excited about his life. But on that night, he stood in front of his 87-year-old great Aunt Susie and looked at the killer and said, "You don't have to do this. We mean no harm to you." Or it was people like Cynthia Hurd, whose life motto was simply to be kinder than necessary. That's who these people were. They weren't famous. A lot of people didn't know them, but they loved their families, they loved their church, and they loved their community. And when that happened, it brought South Carolina to her knees. It was the first time we had a shooting in a religious place. And I remember all I wanted to do was to protect the state, because the national media came in strong and they wanted to define it, they wanted to talk about it, they wanted to immediately debate racism, they wanted to debate gun control, they wanted to debate the death penalty, and you name it, they were talking about it. And I remember strong-arming them back saying, we're not going to do this. We're going to give the time to the families. We're going to go through the funerals. There will be a time and place where we'll have those discussions, but it is not now. The next day, the killer comes out with a manifesto, and he's holding up the Confederate flag. Now, the Confederate flag flew in front of the State House in South Carolina. It used to be on top of the dome, and then they compromised in 2000, and it came right in front of the State House. And when he did that, we have a lot of people in South Carolina who have a great respect for the Confederate flag, not out of reasons of hate, but out of the fact that it's service and their ancestors and sacrifice. That was the way they look at it. And then you had, obviously, the small minority that saw it for what it was, but he hijacked what that was. Take it a step further, go another day or 2 days after that, and it was the first time the killer was going to be in the courthouse and facing the judge. And the families showed up, unprompted, unplanned, and one by one stood in front of the killer and forgave him. And that forgiveness was so overwhelming that we didn't have protests, we had vigils. We didn't have violence, we had hugs. And we went through a tough few weeks there where we had to debate where that Confederate flag needed to go. And the good people of South Carolina stepped up, and the flag was moved to the museum, and the people of South Carolina showed the entire world what it means to get through a tragedy.
Out of despair, there comes inspiration. And I just want to thank the people of South Carolina, with your leadership, Ambassador, for showing us how we get through those difficult times by sharing love with one another, and not hatred, and not violence, but love and forgiveness. So thank you for that. We're going to move ahead a little bit and talk about the next step from being governor to the great state of South Carolina. And I'd like you to tell the audience a little bit about when you were offered the position to be the UN ambassador, and was it a difficult decision for you to make? And what we really want to know too is, what were those conversations like with President Donald Trump when he was asking you to take on this momentous position?
So it's interesting, I actually knew the president a few years prior. After I won the primary for governor the first time, I received this envelope with this great gold trim, and it had a check in it, and there was a note that said, "You're a winner." And so I had talked to him then, and we had stayed in contact over the years. And then we had a Republican primary. We had 16 people on the stage, a lot of talent on the stage, and I put my backing on another candidate. And it was around that time where he sent out a tweet that said, "Nikki Haley is an embarrassment to South Carolina." In which I responded in a tweet, "Bless your heart." But we really did have a respect for each other. I knew that if you kicked him, he was gonna holler. He knew if you pushed me, I was gonna push back. Fast forward, he wins the primary. I supported him in the general. And I get a call from his new chief of staff, Reince Priebus. And so Reince says, "I need you to come to New York." And I said, "For what?" And he said, "The president-elect wants to see you." And I said, "About what?" And he said, "Secretary of State." I said, "Secretary of State?" I said, "Reince, I'm a governor. I can't be Secretary of State." And he said, "Well, he wants to see you. We need you to come." So I come the next morning. I go into his office. The first thing the president says is, "Well, I guess your guy didn't win." He just couldn't help himself. He just couldn't help himself. I let him kind of stew a little bit. And then we had a great conversation. But I said, "Look, I'm not your person." I said, "We've got a lot going on in the world today. You don't need someone with a learning curve, but I want to be helpful. I want to be supportive. Anything that I can do to help you, I'll be happy to." Later that week, Reince Priebus calls again. He said, "Don't say anything. I just need you to listen. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations." I said, "Reince, I don't even know what the United Nations does. I just know everybody hates it." And he said, the president's going to call you on Monday. I need you to think about this. So we get home. My husband's on the computer, and he says, Nikki, I think you'd be really good at this. And it wasn't a good time because our son was 15, and it would have been a tough time to move him. Our daughter was a freshman in college. Michael and I, my husband, we take care of my parents. They're both in their 80s. My mom has Parkinson's, so it would have been a tough move to go to New York. But the president called that Monday, and he said, all right, Nick, are you going to do this? And I said, well, sir, there'd have to be some conditions for me to consider. And he said, okay, what are they? I said, well, I've been a governor, and I don't want to work for anyone again. I would want to work directly with you, so it would need to be a cabinet position. He said, done. I said, well, I'm a policy girl, and I would want to be in the room when decisions are made, so I would need to be on the National Security Council. He said, done. I said, well, I'm not going to be a wallflower or a talking head. I need to be able to say what I think. And he said, that's exactly why I want you to do this. And he was true to his word from the first day to the last day.
Outstanding. I love it.
You know, and I know we've got a lot of young people in the audience. A lot of people ask me how I knew to ask for those things. And what you have to remember is there's one lesson that I have learned to live by, and that is push through the fear. When challenge comes in front of you, your reaction is naturally to step back. But if you lean in and push through the fear, you find out you're so much stronger on the other side. If I wouldn't push through the fear, I wouldn't have become a legislator. If I wouldn't have pushed through the fear, I wouldn't have become a governor. If I wouldn't have pushed through the fear, I wouldn't have said, okay, I can be a UN ambassador. But what you have to do when you push for the fear is set yourself up for success. I knew what I needed in order to be successful. And so don't be afraid to ask for the platform that you know will bring out the best in you.
Yeah, that is great advice. And taking risk, right? Taking risk and challenging yourself. And I think that is very good for so many folks that are engaging in their first career or looking at opportunities that exist after college. So the book is actually full, and everybody's hopefully got a copy of their book, but it is full of stories about working with President Trump in the White House as a member of his cabinet. And I'm sure that there are plenty of stories and inside information that you can share. Can you shed some light on some of the conversations that you had that would be maybe enlightening for the audience?
Well, you know, a lot of people ask how I got out of the administration without a tweet. And really, it was just the fact that I was very honest with the president. I thought it was important to give him what I wanted from my cabinet when I was governor, which is I wanted them to serve the people, I wanted them to be creative, and I wanted them to speak up if they saw me going in a wrong direction. And so with the president, I was always very honest with him. If he did something that I thought was good, I supported, I pushed through, I rallied, whatever needed to happen. If I saw him making what I thought was a wrong decision, I would call or meet with him and say, I think this is a mistake. Instead, I think you should consider X. And he would always say, well, how do you see that playing out? And we would discuss it. And he was really good about hearing other opinions. Didn't mean I won all the time, but it meant that he was open to listening. But he would often make life a little interesting. When I had, this is one of many stories, but when it was the first high-level week at the United Nations. So at the United Nations, there's 1 week out of the year where 193 countries send the highest people in their, the highest caliber of their delegations to New York for 1 week in the name of peace and security. Every head of state comes in, gives a massive speech meant for the world. And so this was the president's first high-level week speech. So we had the meetings all lined up. We had approved everything, and he gave me a call, and he said, just wanted to touch base with you. Did you get the speech? And I said, yes, sir, I did. It's fantastic, and it was. And I said, but, you know, I really want to set the tone for you. I said, the UN is a different kind of place. I said, it's serious. So when you give your speech, it's not like a rally. I said, they're not going to cheer for you, but don't take it personally. I said, I want you to think of it like church. It's just like church. He said, church, got it. And he said, but I had this idea, I want to run it past you. And I said, okay. He said, I was thinking about calling, what if I referred to Kim as Little Rocket Man in the speech? I said, sir, remember the part I said about church? I said, it's a really serious crowd. I said, I really don't know how they're going to take it, but you're the president. If you want to do it, you can. And he said, well, I tweeted it out this morning, and it killed with my base. I thought it was fantastic. So you can fast forward a couple of days later, he's going to give his speech. We sit down, the North Korean delegation's in the front row. And then he goes and he says it. And everybody's sitting there, and they have their translator pieces in, right? And all of a sudden you see them go. And then they started to laugh. But a few hours later, I'm meeting with the president of Uganda. And he sits back and he goes, so, Ambassador, what are we going to do about this little rocket man? And before the week was over, everybody was referring to him as Rocket Man. So I guess, but that was one of many stories working with the president.
Oh, that's awesome. That's really good. Oh, and I bet there are hundreds more.
It's never a dull moment.
No, never a dull moment. So one topic that I'm always very interested in, of course, is leadership. And there is, I believe, a chapter in the book. It's I Don't Get Confused and women's leadership. So as a woman, what does it mean to, quote, know the power of your voice, end quote, which is something that you do reference quite a bit in your book. Can you explain that for us?
Well, I've always thought that people should use the power of their voice. I mean, you really can move things when you use it at the right place, at the right time, with the right tone. And I think that it's something you learn over time of when the right time is. You always hear pick and choose your battles. And I think that as you get further along in life, you get better at it. I do have a 24-hour rule that I always try and use. I don't always use it, but I always try and use it. In that if something is hot and it's moving and you feel your blood pressure going up and it's dramatic, if you can wait 24 hours, usually by the next morning, you're more tempered, you're thinking more clearly, and the right things come out. But the other thing you have to learn is use your voice to protect yourself. And the book, with all due respect, actually came from a time where I needed to insert my voice, and it came from the fact we had had a meeting, National Security Council meeting, and through the meeting, everyone had decided that we were going to put sanctions on Russia. And I talked to the president the next day after that. We were going forward with the sanctions. And I never was on the Sunday shows unless the White House asked me to be. And they had asked me to be on Face the Nation that Sunday morning. So I go on there. We're discussing the issue with Russia, and I say, well, and, sanctions are coming down on Russia if, Stephen Mnuchin has sanctions coming down on Russia if he hasn't already brought them down. And then we left it. I get a call from Stephen, who's a great friend, get a call from him that afternoon. He goes, Nikki, we've got a little bit of a problem. And I said, what happened? He said, the president changed his mind. He said, he's not going to do the sanctions. Well, it's fine. A president can always change their mind. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't fault him in any way for that. He had another strategy in place, and that was fine. And I said, well, just fix it. Go tell them that. And he said, well, they're going to come out with a statement in the morning, and hopefully it'll get it addressed. Next morning, statement comes out, doesn't fix it. The press is still asking the question, why did Nikki say that there were sanctions? Where are the sanctions? What's happening? So I called multiple people in the administration, Chief of Staff, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, Bolton at the time. And I said, look, we've got a problem. There's nothing wrong with the president changing his mind. Just go out there and tell the truth. Go tell what happened. But everybody's like calling our office, you need to fix this. They said, okay. That was Monday. Tuesday morning happens. The level is rising. And I said, okay, this is the deal. Either y'all fix it by 5 o'clock today, or I'm gonna fix it by 5 o'clock today. And trust me, it will go a lot better if y'all fix it. Nothing happens. And then I think it was like 4:45 or so, and my friend Larry Kudlow goes out in front of the press, and they asked the question about the sanctions, and he said, well, I think Nikki just got momentarily confused. So that was it. And I happened to look at the television, and the 5 was getting ready to come on Fox. And I called my friend Dana Perino, and I said, can you call me real quick? She called, she said, hey, what's up? And I said, I need to put out a statement. She said, okay, what is it? I said, will you just say one sentence? With all due respect, I don't get confused.
Yay!
She said, that's it? And I go, that's it. I said, I'll text it to you so you have it in writing. And so she goes and she does it. Within 10 minutes, Larry calls me. Nikki, I'm so sorry. You know I love you. I have my tail between my legs. I'm so sorry. And I said, Larry, at what point do you say I am confused? And he said, I know, I shouldn't have done it. Trust me, I'll make it up to you. I said, no, you will make it up to me. And you will do it by going out there and telling them that you were wrong and that I wasn't. He was like, I can't do that. And I go, oh, yes, you can and you will. And he did. In fairness to him, he immediately went out, contacted a reporter. But what was surprising to me is how it went like, it was a simple moment of me defending myself. And how it went viral across the country on T-shirts, on mugs, on everything. And it goes to show so many people have been in a moment. And I hope the lesson you take from that is no one is going to protect your integrity but you. So people can say they're gonna do it, say they're gonna do it, and say they're gonna do it. But at the end of the day, you have to do it. It's all you have. And you have to know how to protect yourself. And so that was another lesson learned.
Right, a very powerful voice, and we are glad that you have been able to defend yourself. And I love that. It's just a true strength.
Because you can always kick with a smile. The goal is you don't have to be hateful to get your point across.
Absolutely. And so really using that power of your voice. Now, you have used the power of your voice in certain circumstances to pull people together after tragedy. You've used the power of your voice to defend yourself. But there are other times too, and I remember this quite clearly, when you use the power of your voice to have the backs of our allies when you were serving as ambassador to the United Nations. And I remember this. How many of you remember taking names? Taking names of those who don't have our allies' backs. And I remember that quite clearly. And oh my gosh, okay, so I was really impressed, gotta say it. So if you would just explain to us, what does taking names mean to you?
I really didn't think it was going to ruffle as many feathers as it did. And that's when I realized I wasn't that much of a diplomat. But I purposely, when I went to the United Nations, I obviously did a crash course in foreign policy and studied, who our friends were, who our foes were, what our conflicts were, what we needed to work on, but I purposely didn't study the do's and don'ts of the UN. I wanted to be able to go in there with fresh eyes. I wanted to know that I had, goals that I wanted to achieve, and I didn't want the bureaucracy of all of that to get in the way. So when I went and first gave my, went to go talk to the press the first time, I said, it's a new day at the United States mission at the United Nations. It was important to me that countries didn't have to like us, but I wanted them to know what we were for. So I wanted it to be very clear what the U.S. was for, what it was against, and not give any gray areas to them in the process. And I told them, I said, look, and we're going to have the backs of our allies, and we're going to be taking names of those that aren't with us. And what I saw at the United Nations was you've got 193 countries, most who resent us on any given day. Every day felt like you had to put on body armor. You knew you were going to have a fight that day. You just didn't know which country it was going to be. But they would jab and jab and jab, but then they'd turn around and have their hand out wanting foreign aid. And that was the part that bothered me, is you can't have, and a perfect example is you had Pakistan. We were giving Pakistan $1 billion of aid for their military. And they were turning around and harboring terrorists that were trying to kill our soldiers. It didn't make sense. That wasn't being a good partner. They weren't having our backs, and we no longer give that $1 billion to Pakistan anymore. Doesn't mean they can't be our friend again in the future, but it means that we have to change the way we do our relationships. And I think that was really important. And then, having the backs of our friends, I went in there and it was almost like reliving that feeling when I was a 5-year-old on the playground. Seeing the way Israel was bullied at the United Nations was the most unconscionable thing I had ever seen. Here you have a country that is a bright spot in a really tough neighborhood. They share our democratic values. All of our values we share. And you saw Israel constantly just kicked and kicked and kicked because they always had been. And so they would have this one session on the Middle East every single month. And we have plenty of issues in the Middle East. But all they would ever talk about was Israel. And I came to refer to it as the Israel bashing session. So, it was taking names of our friends, it was taking names of our foes, and it was making sure that everybody knew that we were holding each one of them to account.
Taking names. Yep. Taking names. And I do want to be cognizant of our time, so I have one more general question that we can use as all-encompassing. But again, following that same theme, taking names and using the power of your voice, I think this one is really important. You were really an outspoken champion for human rights while you were at the UN, including in areas such as Venezuela, Syria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And much of your advocacy really came from time you spent visiting those affected areas by war and conflict. So we thank you for doing that. Can you tell us a little bit about those experiences and then how they shaped your work at the United Nations?
Well, I think that everybody deserves human dignity. And the unfortunate part about the job at the UN is you go to places that most Americans won't go, most Americans don't want to go, and you see some things you can't unsee. And I would always make a point to ask when we'd go to an area to sit in a room with a group of women. No offense to the fellas in the audience, but the women had a way of, you could sit down with them, they could tell you what the problem was, how they got to that point, and how to fix it. They were very clear on it. They, in many cases, I would always go see refugees. In many cases, they had started their own businesses. They were focused on their kids. They just really always had what was needed. And so, for example, when I went to Jordan and Turkey, we were talking with the Syrian refugees, and it was those women that were able to tell me how their children needed psychological help because they had seen so many things, what they were dealing with in terms of finding jobs. When we went to the South Sudan refugee camp, there was one woman that I talked to, and she started to tell me the story about how she had 6 kids and she couldn't look them in the eye in the mornings for breakfast. And I said, and she started to cry, and I said, why can't you look at your children? And she said, because they saw me get raped in front of them. And so you hear these stories, and it was at that camp that there were 100 women in the room, and I was sitting on a chair, and these women would start to tell their story. And one would start crying, and then before we knew it, the whole room had started crying because they had all been traumatized. So I start on the chair, and I end up on the floor hugging them and helping them, and you really do realize that every person deserves the freedoms and the ability to worship and the ability to be safe and all of those things. And there are a lot of places in the world that don't do that. And my parents reminded my brothers, my sister, and me every day how blessed we were to live in America. And you go to those places and you come back and you realize that we truly are very blessed.
We are. Thank you very much, Nikki. So we're going to move into some audience questions, and this is a current event one, and one that we've just experienced here in recent weeks. But audience question number 1 was, how do you feel about the removal of our armed forces out of Syria? And what next actions would you personally recommend to the United States government to do next?
This is a tough one because I think that I disagreed strongly with us pulling our forces out of Syria. And the reason is the Kurds had been there and fought alongside us against terrorism for years. They've lost a lot of blood. 11,000 have lost their lives. And it goes back to the taking names. You have the backs of your allies, you take names of the enemies. The Kurds had been allies with us. They had fought alongside of us. And I understand the president's point of wanting to get out of endless wars. And none of us wants to be at a war. But the asset of having troops on the ground, especially for intelligence purposes, is so important. So when you saw the terrorist al-Baghdadi get killed, it's because those troops were on the ground. It's because they had the ability to communicate and know where he was. And I think that's what we have to remember is, we have military forces. We have them in Japan and South Korea and all over the world. And it's not because we're in a war, it's for prevention. And it's to make sure we don't get into another war. And it's for intel, and it's to make sure we know what's happening on the ground. And so I'm glad that the president has decided to leave some forces there, whether it's to watch the oil fields or to keep intelligence on the ground. But in hot spots like that, I strongly believe we have to have a footprint. Doesn't need to be a large one. You look at Afghanistan. We had well over 100,000 troops at one point. Now we're down to 14,000. I hope we get lower than that. But having those people on the ground, my husband is a combat veteran and served in Afghanistan, and having those people on the ground that can report back and tell you what's going on, and you know that better than anybody, is so important. And so I hope that we can continue to keep an ear on the ground, and I hope that we can continue to let the Kurds know that we appreciate their partnership over the years.
And we do, yes. So I was just going to make a funny quip too. We do need those forces on the ground, and we could use a few more of those dogs too. Oh. How about that? Yeah.
Give it up for the dog, Conan, right?
Conan, yes. Okay, our second audience question. Ambassador Haley, what led you to conservatism?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So when I was running for office the first time, I didn't know if I was a Republican or Democrat. And I remember my friend saying, well, I told her I wanted to run for office. Actually, when my mom said, do something about it, I decided I wanted to run, and I started talking to different people. And everybody gave me a reason on why I shouldn't do it. I was too young. I had small children. I should start at the school board level and not at the state house level. There was all these reasons that they kept saying not to do it. And interestingly enough, I went to a women's leadership event at Furman University, and Hillary Clinton was there. And she happened to say, for all the reasons people tell you not to do it, that's exactly the reason that you should. So Hillary Clinton is actually the reason. I may not agree with her on a lot of things, but she is actually the reason that I made the jump. And so then I had to figure out whether I was Republican or Democrat. So my friend said, are you Republican or Democrat? And I said, I don't know. And she said, well, do you think government should tell you how to live your life, or do you think you should decide it? I said, well, no, I want to decide how to live my life. She said, well, do you think that government should control how you spend your money, or should you control how you spend your money? And I said, if I work hard, I want to spend my money. And she said, well, do you think government can fix more things than not? And I said, no, government definitely messes up more than it fixes. And she goes, honey, you're a Republican.
Okay, the next audience question that we have is, as a first-generation American of Sikh immigrant parents, a Southerner, a female, and conservative, how would you respond to those who don't feel the Republican Party is welcoming to minorities and women?
Well, I think the Republican Party can always do better, right? I think we should always want to be better, no matter what situation we're in. And, I look at the fact that, you're a strong Republican woman. We have some strong Republican women. We need to continue to encourage women. I want women involved, Republican or Democrat. We're 51% of the voting population, and I think we need to have as many women out there using the power of their voice as we can. Do I want them to be Republicans? Of course I do. But having said that, it's really tough right now, because what I have found is the left is really hard on Republican women. They really give us a hard time if we don't think like they do. And you can turn on the TV and you see how toxic it is. And you can see all the reasons it would be tough for women to do that. But I constantly am being hit from the left for being a woman or being Indian. I saw Elise Stefanik yesterday was being hit by the left as well, and we just get badgered. And the only way to fix that is to get more of us out there and more of us using the power of our voice to do it. I actually saw Ben Shapiro the other day give a speech, and he was criticizing anti-Semitism and hate against the alt-right groups, and the left came out against him. And so I think that, Republicans get a bad rap, and I think we can certainly do better. The one thing I've always said, being Indian American, is, Republicans shouldn't wait for minorities to come to them. We should go to those groups. I always said you should go to places that are uncomfortable to go. One, because you'll learn something. And two, because you'll open doors of communication that you never had. And so I see that with the Indian American community. I see it with the Jewish community. I see it with so many that I do think the Republican Party needs to do a better job of going out there. And I think the Republican Party needs to do a better job of voicing it when the left hits us. to let them know they can't have the double standards of saying, go women on their side, and then just bashing the women on our side.
Right. No, great point. Yes, I feel that, I think, every day, too.
You live it every day.
And, yeah, we're living in interesting times. So we do just have a few minutes left here before 8 p.m., and so I am going to ask this last question, and I do think that this is very appropriate for the day and the age that we live in right now. So this final audience question that we have for Ambassador Haley tonight: bipartisanship seems dead in American politics. What can American politicians do to bridge that divide and bring more civility back to American politics?
You know, it's a very toxic time right now. I mean, it's uncomfortable. You know it's bad because if someone puts down a good piece of policy, everybody wants to know whose it is before they decide whether to support it. And that's when we know we've hit kind of a low. The part that I think bothers me is we have watched both parties now refer to each other as evil. And that hits a soft point with me because I've seen evil. I've been to the Democratic Republic of Congo where they use rape as a weapon of war. I've been to South Sudan where I've met with women who have said that military came in, took their babies from them, and threw them into a fire, and then forced them to eat the baby's flesh. I've been on the Simon Bolivar Bridge, watching thousands of Venezuelans walk hours in the heat, holding their babies to get the one meal they might get that day. The average Venezuelan adult has lost 24 pounds. I've had to look at pictures of children who have died from chemical weapons by Assad in Syria. That's evil. What we have in our country are real issues that deserve real debate. But we need to be responsible and realize that through all of that real debate, still, on our worst day, we are blessed to live in America, and we need to be grateful for it. And Joni, before we end, I want to take a point of personal privilege. You can't write a book like this and pour your heart and soul out without having a fantastic partner to write it with. I had an amazing collaborator, and she's here with us tonight. Jessica Gavor, will you stand up, please, and let everybody see your face? Thank you.
Fantastic. This has been a very, very enjoyable evening. Ambassador Haley, thank you so much. And before we release the audience, we have one last thing that we would like to do in addition to our thanks. Again, President, thank you so much for the wonderful hospitality that you have shown here at GW University. SJ, again, thank you for your wonderful leadership as well. It is a pleasure to get to know you. And what we would like to finish with, would you like to explain what we're going to do, Ambassador Haley?
We are going to memorialize the moment with a selfie. So everybody hold up your book.
Okay, we do have a photographer that's coming. Thank you. You all look spectacular.